Well, hello everyone and welcome. My name is Sharon Bonney and I'm the Executive Director for the Coalition on Adult Basic Education. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Investing in Quality, a Blueprint for Adult Literacy Programs and Funders. I wanted to let everybody know that you'll receive your certificate for CEU verification, and that will come within 24 hours of this webinar. As well, any resources that are shared will be posted to our Adult Educators repository, and I'll also put the link for that that's here on the slide. I'll put that into the chat box. I also just wanted to mention that, as you all are likely aware, we have a national public awareness campaign called Educate and Elevate, and we have been able to successfully have over 75,000 contacts with legislators since we launched that on April 1st, 2017. And I'd like to encourage everybody to go to educateandelevate.org, and you can take action there. Okay, also, I wanted to mention that we have our national conference March 31st through April 3rd, 2019, and this is going to be in New Orleans, Louisiana, so we hope you'll join us. And if you're a member, all members can apply for mini grants valued at $350 as well. All members qualify for the membership discount, which is $75 off, so we hope that you'll join us there. We just finished up our national conference this past 3 weeks ago in Phoenix, Arizona, which is where I had the pleasure of hearing Ira, who is our featured presenter today, as he talked about today's topic, which we'll share in just a moment. I also wanted to mention that we have a survey that will give you a prompt at the end of this presentation, and we would love your thoughts about the COABE journal. We really feel that your voice matters, and we want to have a journal that is practitioner friendly and that people are using. So we hope that at the close of this presentation, you'll take just a couple of minutes to help us out and give your input. And now for the star of the presentation. Today, I'd like to introduce you to Ira Yankwit. He is the Executive Director of the Literacy Assistance Center, which is a large nonprofit professional development and technical assistance center there in New York City. And as many of you know, Ira is so well known in the field and does such excellent work. And here is his bio. I'll read it real quickly. He is the Executive Director of the Literacy Assistance Center since December 2012. And he has been responsible for a number of initiatives in that role. He plays a lead role in the New York City Coalition for Adult Literacy, and was the chair of NICAL's, I'm sorry, I'm saying that wrong, the Grassroots Literacy Coalition. Ira has also taught high school equivalency, managed a community-based adult literacy program, and trained teachers and administrators, and has served as a director of the New York City Regional Adult Education Network from 2004 through 2007. So, Ira, thank you so much for taking time to present today, and now I'd like to turn this over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Sharon, and thank you all for joining me today and for taking time to learn about the report that released back in December, Investing in Quality, a Blueprint for Adult Literacy Programs and Funders. Sharon, can you see my screen?
I cannot see your screen, Ira, no.
Okay, so if people can forgive me for one moment, let me...
So while Ira's pulling that up, if everybody would just put your name and where you're joining us from there in the chat box, and how many are in the room with you, that would be fantastic. And Ira, now we can see it.
You can see it now. Super. Sorry about that, everyone, but thank you for your patience. Okay, so I just want to begin by talking about the goals of my presentation today and give you the game plan for the next hour or so. So the goals are pretty straightforward. I want to explain the context, background, and process of creating the Investing in Quality report. And at this point, hopefully all of you have a copy of that in hand or on your screen. If you don't, here's the URL where you can access it right now. And I am at one point during the presentation going to give you a few minutes to skim through it if you haven't already, or if you have to kind of identify some questions that you might have for me. But you should have that available to you. Obviously, I want to introduce the core content and findings of the report. I want to discuss how we're using the report in New York City. And of course, I want to answer as many of your questions as you can. I know every time I'm looking at somebody's PowerPoint presentation, I'm always wondering, how long is this and how many slides am I going to have to endure? So I want to tell you that there are 15 slides to this PowerPoint before we actually get to the Q&A, and we're already on number 2. So really the goal is to move through the PowerPoint and get to the Q&A. I also want to say that because there is a real range of practitioners on the call with us on the webinar, I suspect we have everyone from policymakers through program managers, through teachers and tutors, maybe even some students, that I've tried to cast the net widely in terms of the different pieces of this that I'm going to touch on. And so I imagine that there will be something in this presentation for everyone, but there also may be some pieces that folks are less interested in, and I apologize for that. But hopefully by the end of the hour, you'll feel that I touched all the points that were of interest to you. Okay, so what is the Literacy Assistance Center, of which I am the executive director? And Sharon touched on this in her introduction to me. We are a nonprofit organization here in New York City dedicated to strengthening and expanding the adult education system and to advancing adult literacy as a core value in our society and foundation for equal opportunity and social justice. Our primary work is professional development and technical assistance and includes teacher training, instructional coaching, curriculum development, data management and data analysis, and leadership support for adult education practitioners in CBOs, libraries, community colleges, public school systems, and union-based training programs. And there's an important point here, which I think is that, and it's a big part of the story of the creation of this report, which is that here in New York City and New York State, I think we are somewhat unique in that there is no exclusive publicly funded provider of adult literacy services. Our combination of federal, state, and local dollars is dispersed among CBOs, libraries, as well as the community colleges and our public school system. And we also have in New York City very strong unions that have their own training funds that they fund classes in as well. And we here at the LAC work with all of those. We at the LAC engage in advocacy primarily at the city and state level as a core member of the New York City Coalition for Adult Literacy, which is a citywide coalition comprised of literacy teachers, managers, students, and advocates and allies from the CBOs, colleges, and libraries across New York City. So you may notice that a minute ago I talked about all of the sectors, including the unions and the local public school system, which also provide services. But because the funding streams are different for the public school system and the unions, our advocacy coalition is comprised mostly of the CBOs, the colleges, and the library programs, because these receive the same sources of funding or comparable sources of funding and often face the same challenges and issues. But as an advocacy organization, our overarching goal is to create a system that provides quality, comprehensive, and accessible educational services for the 2.2 million adults in New York City who either lack English language proficiency, a high school diploma, or both. Okay, so I want to start by giving the context and the background of how we came to this report. And our story starts 2 years ago in the spring of 2016, right around this time, when the Advocacy Coalition launched a campaign to increase city funding for adult literacy by $16 million. Just to give you a sense, when we launched this campaign, the city was investing about $5 million in the community-based organizations and community college programs, and we were hoping to increase that an additional 16. Our advocacy campaign really got some steam behind it, and we found ourselves talking to city council members, members of the mayor's administration, other funders that were for the first time taking an interest in and becoming more supportive of funding adult literacy education. But as we were pressing for an increase in overall funding and higher rates for the community-based programs, these officials, policymakers, funders continuously asked us the same question. What are the defining features of a quality adult literacy program, and what does it cost to run one? And the reality was we didn't have, as a field, a consistent answer. And I think everyone on this call understands why that is, that depending on the communities you're serving, the types of learners you're serving, the answers to these questions can be different. But it was a challenge for us when we actually had policymakers and funders who had interest that we weren't able to give them a clear, direct, succinct answer to these questions. So in the end of our advocacy campaign, we actually didn't get our $16 million, but we won a one-year increase of $12 million, which ended up tripling the city's total direct investment in adult literacy from the prior fiscal year. Now, as the Literacy Assistance Center, we receive city and state money to provide professional development and technical assistance to the city and state funded programs. So as part of the city's $12 million increase in funding, we spoke to our city funder and asked if, with the corollary increase in funding that we were getting for technical assistance, if we could use some of that to develop a document that would essentially answer the questions that the funders were asking us, that would define the features of a high-quality community-based adult literacy program and the true costs of running one. And the idea here was to create a common framework that could be used to guide adult literacy program design and development and to inform policy decisions and capacity building initiatives. And even though what our funder was essentially doing by giving us permission and support to do this was really ultimately subjecting themselves to greater advocacy for higher rates and a greater investment on their part, they welcomed that. And so we were funded to develop the report with city dollars that you have in front of you now. Okay, so what was the process that we undertook to develop this report? Well, the first thing we did was engage the 6-person advisory committee to help us guide the project, and this included 4 local program managers, some more veteran, some newer to the field, as well as a advocate from an umbrella organization here in the city, and a veteran adult literacy researcher and practitioner here in the city. And we started the project by reviewing the existing literature on indicators of program quality. I'm sure many of you have seen some of these. Some of these documents date back nearly 40 years. And there was real consistency in what we saw as we looked at these documents. Obviously, things like technology have changed over 40 years, but the call to do this for full-time staff, for jobs with benefits, for investment in professional development, for investment in curriculum development, for investment in technology, even though the technology was different 40 years ago than it is now. There was real consistency across the documents that we read. So that made our task easy. Well, our first step was to develop an initial outline and framework where we actually synthesized the literature on indicators of program quality. And then our goal was to really engage practitioners in the field in the process of creating this report. So in addition to the advisory committee, we conducted interactive feedback sessions with more than 90 adult literacy program managers and staff, primarily of the New York City funded community-based programs. And we also collected input from 102 students from 4 adult literacy programs in 4 boroughs. From the spring through the fall of 2017, we developed multiple iterations of the content of the report, and this is where we consulted senior staff of the New York City Department of Youth and Community Development, which is the city agency through which the city funding for community-based adult literacy programs funds, also the city agency that funds us. And we also consulted colleagues in the Mayor's Office of Workforce Development, which has been a real partner with us throughout this process. And this was important because we obviously wanted in the end that the city and the city funders endorsed our report, because otherwise, when we actually eventually used it for advocacy purposes, we would not have had a receptive audience. So we wanted them to vet it and to fully endorse it so that they would be more open to our advocacy requests, as well as to incorporate it into programmatic design decisions. So in addition to developing the building blocks, which is the first half of the report, we also developed a program cost model and sample budget, and I'm going to talk more about that in a bit. We completed our first draft back in July, got feedback from our funders and advisory board, created a second draft this past September, and presented it to the senior program, fiscal, and administrative staff of our funding agency, received further feedback, and released the final draft, which you have in front of you now back in December. Okay, so what I want to focus on now is the content of the report itself. And this is where, if you have the report in front of you, it might be valuable to take it out. So the report is really broken down into 3 sections. There are the 14 building blocks for a quality adult literacy program, and these are the 14 key components identified by adult literacy program leaders and students as the foundation of a comprehensive, effective, and sustainable community-based adult literacy program. You can find the summary of those on page 8, and then the details details in the following pages 9 to 27. The next section are the key elements for investment. This is the personnel, OTPS, and organizational systems and supports that need to be funded to successfully implement the 14 building blocks. It's on pages 28 to 33. And then the defining cost. This is the cost model and sample program budget, and you can find that on pages 34 to 40. And at this point, what I'm going to suggest, both so I can catch my breath, you can stop listening to me for a while, and especially for those of you who haven't had a chance to thumb through this, I'm going to give you 3 minutes just to take some time to go through it and skim it and identify some questions that you might have for it that you can post and that we can get to later. So I'm setting my stopwatch for 3 minutes, and let's go ahead and do that. Okay, thank you. So I don't know if it's inappropriate to have dead air during a webinar, but I did want to make sure that everybody got a chance to at least skim through this if you haven't already. And I know people's time is precious and that folks may not have had a chance beforehand. So what I've moved on to now is the description of, or the titles, if you will, of the building blocks. This corresponds to what you see on page 8 of the report. And as I said earlier, we don't claim to have been saying anything new in the sense that there's not a single thing listed here that practitioners in the field have not been saying are critical components of adult literacy programs for 40 years. Again, I think what we did was to articulate these and update them through the subsequent pages that go into detail. And I think really the thing that makes this unique is the cost model and sample budget. So I want to talk about that for a few minutes. So the question is, what does it cost to implement all 14 of the building blocks? And in our cost model, the annual cost for a program seat, which we refer to as a slot, is $7,400 for 400 hours of instruction and connected support. And I'm going to talk in a minute about the distinction between doing this as a seat or slot cost and doing it as a per student cost. How did we arrive at the $7,400 for 400 hours of instruction? Well, what we did was we worked to create a hypothetical program model. So something that, a program model that might not be identical to any single program in the field, but reflected more or less what was typical of what we saw in community-based adult literacy programs. So in our hypothetical program model, we assumed 12 classes meeting an average of 10 hours a week for 40 weeks a year. And we imagined an average of 18 slots per class for a total of 216 annual program slots for students. Now, that doesn't mean that the program would just have 216 students. There might be 2 or 3 or even 4 students who cycle through a slot, but that there would be a minimum of 216 slots at this 18 slot per class with 12 classes. And we assumed that all of the key elements for investment were funded at reasonable market rates in order to serve the students adequately. And if you look not just at the budget, on pages 37 through 39, but if you look at the very last page, on page 40, the footnotes, it identifies how we came up with the market rate and reasonable cost for the key elements of investment. And we really did a great deal of research to come up with these. So just to give a couple of examples, you know, when we looked for salaries, we looked at ONET salaries. We looked at the salaries that people were paid comparable positions in the New York City Department of Education. When we look at occupancy costs, we really went out and found out what were midpoint commercial rental rates in the boroughs of New York City. We actually sat down and figured out exactly how many square footage of space you would need to run these 12 classes and have enough room for offices. And then we calculated the occupancy rate that way. No one who has read this has disputed the legitimacy of the costs. There are real questions about whether or not we can get funded at this rate, but nobody's questioned the dollar amounts that we've attributed or how we arrived at them. And I think we're very proud of that we did enough research that these are all recognized as reasonable market rates. Something that isn't said in the report, but we put this in because we know that in some programs and some funding streams, programs are funded at an instructional hour rate. And if you do the math, in this model, the instructional hour rate comes out to be $333 per hour. And the math there is dividing the $7,400 per slot by 216 slots and multiplying that by 4,800 instructional hours. Okay, so why cost per slot rather than cost or price per student? And this is articulated in the report on pages 35 and 36, probably better than I'll articulate it now. But in a nutshell, the reason we went with cost per slot rather than cost or price per student is that the annual cost per slot is a more reliable and stable unit of measure than the cost per student. So imagine, if you will, 2 classes that have the same number of classes meeting for the same number of hours a week, the same number of weeks per year, with the same number of slots. If in one of those programs, let's say that serves newly arrived immigrants with virtually no education in their homelands and no literacy in their native language and no spoken English proficiency, one would hope that those students would be able to persist and have the resources to sustain their education throughout the entire year. One would hope that you would have the same students in June as you do in September, because we know with those students, their progress is going to be slow and steady, and they're not going to achieve their goals just over the course of that 1 year, and certainly not during the course of the year. So in that program and in those classes, you want the same students in those slots in June as you want in September. Imagine another program that has the same number of classes, same number of hours a week, weeks per year, slots per class, but that is serving very high-level ASE students who are coming in, say, reading, writing, doing math at a 10th, 11th, even 12th grade level. Your hope is that those students are going to come in, they're going to get what they need, they're going to get their high school equivalency, and they're going to move on. And that in that case, you might hope and project 2, 3, even 4 times the number of students going through the same number of slots during a year. So the reality is that, but the reality is that the core costs remain the same. You need the same number of teachers, you need the same number of program administrators, the same number of counselors, the same number of books. There may be some variation in your high school equivalency class. Maybe students are taking the books home, so you need to replace them as students leave. But essentially, the inputs, the costs, are going to be the same, regardless of whether it's the same students at June as in September, or 2 or 3 or 4 students have cycled through the slots. So the cost per slot we see as a much more stable and reliable unit of measure for cost. Moreover, what we see when we do price per student funding is that it actually incentivizes increased enrollment rather than increased retention or outcomes. And we've seen absurd situations here, which I'm sure you've seen too, where a program projects we're going to have 100 students flow through this class in any given year. And that's based on an assumption that 2 to 3 students are going to flow through every seat. But then, remarkably, they have higher rates of retention. They have better outcomes for the students who they were able to retain longer. But they now haven't met their projections for the number of students that they were going to serve. And they're actually penalized rather than rewarded for retention and for greater outcomes. And that can actually, as we say in this third bullet point here, create backwards incentives for programs to have higher student turnover rather than to encourage programs to retain and engage their students long enough to meet all their goals. So for all of those reasons, this report projects cost in terms of slot or seat rather than cost or price per student. Now, having said that, we wanted to make clear that even though we did the research and projected reasonable market rate costs, that this is a point of reference. It's not a prescription. That if you change any of the program parameters or any of the variable costs in the budget, you change the cost per slot. Some programs are operating in higher rent neighborhoods, some in lower rent neighborhoods. Some, in fact, don't pay any rent because their organization owns their building. Some may have higher rates and costs for their staff. Some may have somewhat lower rates and costs. Moreover, if you increase the number of hours of instruction a week, you're going to have to hire more staff, and the costs are going to go up. So while we think our $7,400 cost per slot in our model is reasonable and reliable and defendable, it's a point of reference. It's not a prescription for every program everywhere. Moreover, and this is probably the most important thing that we have had to communicate to funders, that the building blocks can't be used as a stick for program expectations without providing the carrot of increased funding and resources. What we absolutely don't want is that the city or the state says, yes, these 14 building blocks are exactly what every program should have. Start requiring that they implement them without the corresponding funding. No way. And this was our biggest concern and program's biggest fear when we entered into this process. And we have been emphatic that you cannot get these 14 building blocks if you're not going to make that investment at those levels of funding. Okay, so how are we using the report right now? Well, we're using it as a tool for programmatic and fiscal self-assessment and program planning and improvement efforts. So we have started to workshop this with programs in New York City that are interested. We've used it as a tool to do gap analysis, where programs have looked at the 14 building blocks, said what they feel that they're doing well, what they feel they're doing but not well enough because they don't have the resources, and what they don't feel they're doing because they don't have the resources. And just from that analysis, even without the additional funding, they've been able to identify steps that they could potentially take to engage in modest program improvement efforts. And we're very pleased to be able to support that. Of course, the other piece of that is then we have actually turned the budget into an interactive spreadsheet where programs have been able to plug in different numbers to really see what their fiscal gaps are, and then use those either to approach their home organization, their board of directors, private funders, or individual advocacy efforts. along those lines, our advocacy coalition, NICAL, is now using the report as a springboard to bolster advocacy efforts to achieve increased funding rates for programs. So not just to call for the city to fund more programs for more students, but also to increase the rate per slot so that we could serve students more comprehensively and effectively and in ways they deserve. My organization, the Literacy Assistance Center, is also reaching out to private funders here in New York City to solicit investments in a potential demonstration project. What we really have here is a hypothetical. What this report says is, if you fund programs at this level to invest in the resources that it describes to implement the 14 building blocks, you will see greater outcomes and significantly greater outcomes than you're seeing now. Because that funding has never been there, because those investments have never been made, we only have a hypothesis. We don't have demonstrated proof of that. And so we've reached out to a very large funder here in New York City that has a focus on immigrant integration. 75% of the students in our programs in New York are immigrants. That's both in ESOL, but also many of those immigrant students are in our ABE and HSE classes. And we are asking them to make a major investment to test the hypothesis. And hopefully the next time I speak to any of you, I'll be able to give you an update on that and say that that funding is forthcoming. But that's one of the things that we're aggressively pursuing here. Moving forward, we have offered the funder of this project, the funder of the community-based adult literacy programs here, the Department of Youth and Community Development, to engage in a more formal programmatic and resource gap analysis using this report, which we hope they then might use to push for greater funding per slot in the next RFP they put out, which is probably coming out over the next 2 years. We've also begun to introduce the report to other city and state agencies who oversee adult literacy to inform them, to inform their program designs and funding decisions. Most principally, we've shared this with the State Education Department and their Adult Education Office, which is the main source of funding. It's the office that the WIOA funds flow through, as well as some substantial state funds. We are using this as part of our technical assistance as a framework to guide new program development if and when new programs get off the ground. We've also talked about reproducing the report in different forms and formats for different purposes and audiences, and hopefully periodically updating the report. We consider it a living document and by no means a final and complete statement or work. So with that, your questions and or feedback, and Sharon, with your help, please tell me what I should be clicking on my screen to be able to engage in that discussion.
Great. So first of all, thank you for that wonderful presentation, Ira. And now the next thing is you're going to want to go down to where it says Q&A, or I can read the question for you. There's just one, actually.
Okay.
From our friend David Rosen. He says, "Hi Ira, great presentation. I wonder if you have a tool that adult basic skills programs and adult schools from around the country might use. Maybe a spreadsheet, for example, where they could."
So Sharon, you cut out there, but I actually see the question.
Okay.
And thank you very much for the question, David, and thank you for joining us. You know, if people don't know, I mean, David is a mentor of mine. You know, he is a longtime leading advocate in adult literacy and education. It's an honor to have you participate, David. Thank you. Yes, we've actually, as I mentioned a couple of minutes ago, as part of the technical assistance that we're providing here to programs in New York City, we've actually turned this budget into the kind of interactive spreadsheet that I think you have in mind. And, you know, I would welcome some input on that. So David, maybe offline, you and I can take a look at that together and craft it in such a way that we can disseminate it. I know through the listserv that you moderate, through COABE, and through any other organizations or vehicles, I'd be delighted to share that as a tool, and also to guide anyone through its use that might be interested. So maybe we can pursue that offline together. And so I'm now seeing another question from Farah Parks. What has the response to the report been so far? Thank you for that question. It's been very positive. I think, you know, for the program managers and teachers and other staff associated with adult literacy, it's been very affirming, both of what they, and this doesn't surprise us because they played such a role in creating the report in the first place. But I think even those who did not play a role, who have seen this, it's really been affirming of what they've known and been saying are the building blocks, are the components that make a high quality adult literacy program. And I think obviously very affirming of the costs. You know, right now we're funded here in New York at a per student rate of approximately $800 to $1,200 per student. While this really varies, what we've said is one can assume on average 2 students per slot in any given year. So if you do the quick math, $7,400 per slot, 2 students per slot, that's $3,700 per student. That's 3 to 4 times the level of funding that we're getting now through our city and state funders. And so I think for programs to have, you know, the research, if you will, the data, if they will, to make that case, yes, we have been chronically underfunded. We're getting, you know, a fourth of what we really need to provide services that students deserve. This has been very energizing and encouraging, and has really prompted more and more program managers and staff to engage, and students to engage in advocacy efforts. So we've been very pleased that we've gotten the positive response. And again, the funders themselves have given us a positive response. They have not come forward with the funding, but they've said, you know, that yes, this is what makes a good program. We know this is what it costs. This is an advocacy issue. You know, if they're the public funders, what they're saying, if they are saying to us, you need to push this with the mayor, with the city council, with our state legislature, with our governor, and really make the case for this, as well as with private funders, although we don't see a lot of private funding for adult literacy in New York City. And so that's in some ways a heavier lift, although we're hoping that by introducing this to private funders as a potential demonstration project, we can increase that. But the short answer is, whether it's adult literacy providers, whether it's public funders, and even some private funders, the response has been very positive. So thank you for that question. And now I see a question from Mary. She's now actually motivated to read the full report. Thank you very much, Mary. I hope it lives up to your expectations. You appreciate the focus on retention. If now only federal funders could, yes. You're fortunate to tap on a variety of funding sources that smaller programs may not be able to access. So yes, I don't know if people can see the question the way I can, but Mary is appreciating the focus on retention, and I completely agree that this is a real shortcoming of both federal funders as well as state funders, as well as local funders, as well as private funders. You know, we 2.2 million people in need in New York City, 36 million in need nationally, and we're serving 3 to 4%. I mean, this is a national crisis. It's a national injustice. It's a crisis that isn't being recognized. And I think when people do recognize the crisis, particularly funders who are coming to it for the first time, everyone's first impulse is that we need to, whatever money we can get, we need to serve more. And the more students we serve, the better. And that is certainly true if we're serving them to the point that they can achieve their goals and achieve their outcomes. It's not take them in, serve them for 10 weeks and turn them out, right? And just have more students if they're not meeting their goals, if we're not meeting our outcomes. So I think we need to make the case that sometimes serving fewer is good and better if it means that we're retaining people longer to achieve their outcomes. And we need to make that case to federal funders, state funders, local funders, and private funders. And yes, Mary points out that we're fortunate to be able to tap on a variety of funding sources that smaller programs may not be able to access. And that is absolutely true. And I do think New York has been unique in this, going back to the 80s, which was the first time we got a substantial investment of city funding in adult literacy, and that funding went to community-based organizations, library programs, as well as community college programs and our public school system. And in fact, the history of our organization is very much tied to that. Our organization, which is a private not-for-profit, was founded in the 80s with those same dollars to support those newly funded programs. And it's still the core and heart of our mission and our work today, similar to the organization that David Rosen headed for many years, the Adult Literacy Resource Institute in Boston. And it's encouraging to see more and more professional development and technical assistance centers, whether they be publicly funded or nonprofits, springing up over the years. But yes, you know, we are lucky that we have resources and a recognition that it's not just one institutional provider that can get the job done, that different kinds of programs serve different kinds of students. A question from Joseph Zimmerman. Given that funds and funding policy come from the federal level, is the report going to be used to lobby and advocate at that level? Oh, and this is from my colleague Mertz at Turning Point Brooklyn, which is one of the community-based organizations that receives local and state dollars to provide very high quality adult literacy services. So thank you, Mertz, for joining us. And I actually would turn this question over to Sharon and potentially some of our national advocates. Our local advocacy group does comment on federal policy, but we really haven't had the bandwidth to advocate quite at that level. Our focus has been more city and state. So I would be very interested if some of our national advocates have an interest in using the report. And of course, I would be delighted to play a role in that. So I would turn that over to Sharon to either comment on now, or maybe this is a separate discussion that some of the national advocates could engage in separate from this. Sharon, do you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. Well, I definitely would like to. First, I should just mention that the reason why we asked Ira to do this presentation and actually asked him to fly to Phoenix, Arizona and conduct a session there is because we felt passionately that this was an excellent report and we wanted the field to have full access to it. So that's one piece, is that we think it's a great report and we want everybody to be aware of that. But then the next piece, as far as taking it beyond that, we have to talk internally about how we will do that. But we definitely do support it in the sense that we wanted you all to be aware of the report.
Great. Thank you very much, Sharon. The next question from Julie Dinkhow, and I apologize if I mispronounced your last name, Julie. Do you have a sense of any priority of the 14 building blocks? This is a great question and one that we're often asked. And we've actually been resistant to answer that question because what we feel is that these operate as a whole, that these collectively are what is needed for a comprehensive, high-quality adult literacy program. Certainly what I will say is that that as we engage in the programmatic and fiscal gap analysis with our colleagues in the field, what we're noting is that some of them are highlighting some of these as greater needs than others. So this is a hypothetical example, but I think a common one as well. If you are very focused on moving students from high school equivalency onto a career pathway, post-secondary, education or job training, then and you don't have the resources for job developers, counselors, student support services, you might feel that that is a greater gap and a greater priority for you and your program. If you are working with parents of school-age children who have very, very limited literacy, you might feel that parent engagement in the school system is a priority, is a goal of your students, and you might want to have more resources to develop much more robust curriculum and instruction around parent engagement, parent empowerment, parent participation in the school system. So I would say any given program can look at these and identify which ones they feel they have in place, and then of those that they don't have in place, which are greater or lesser priorities for them. But for us, in terms of articulating what makes a comprehensive high quality program, we feel all of these are of equal importance and value and need to be seen as an integrated whole. And I hope that answers the question and doesn't just sound like equivocation. Okay, from Gloria Plumer, thank you. What has the response been from economic development groups specifically regarding the topic of upskilling to meet the needs of business? And to meet the needs of business and industry. And I apologize, I keep forgetting that not everybody can see these. So that's an excellent question. We have distributed this far and wide. We work with a group called the Workforce Professionals Trainings Institute here, which is funded by private funders to have a workforce development hub that brings together people from business and industry with the workforce development providers and sectors. And there's been some conversation there about this, but I think we need to, this is the next step in our work, is to really get this more fully integrated into those conversations. The short answer is that while we've gotten a lot of positive affirmation, there has not been a lot of discussion, with us around the way this fits in. I think in general, to the extent adult literacy is seen as part of the workforce development system, the career pathway system, and particularly the on-ramp to career pathways and workforce development, to the extent that this report and these building blocks are being recognized as what makes a strong program. I think all those who have an interest in workforce development would support this kind of funding to implement these building blocks and programs. But there has not been the kind of conversation with the economic development world, with business and industry, that we've had yet with adult literacy. And I think that's an important next step. Amanda Watley asks, what unexpected community organization has been a great partner or resource? That's great. As we are consistently asked to do more with less, partnerships have increased in importance. I'm curious to know what groups did you not necessarily expect to work with at the onset, but has proven to be vital to this project? That is such a great question. So much of the leadership of our local advocacy coalition, and I would say much of the success, comes from that professional advocates who work for umbrella organizations here in New York City. So we have an organization called United Neighborhood Houses. It's a membership organization of settlement houses, of community-based organizations. And United Neighborhood Houses' work is to advocate for the program, for those organizations and for the programs that they lead. One of the leaders of our advocacy coalition is the city-state policy director for United Neighborhood Houses, and he has played the leading role in much of our advocacy efforts. We also work with the New York Immigration Coalition, which is a membership organization of immigrant rights and immigrant services organizations. Their vice president has been a leader in our advocacy efforts, and I can name 2 or 3 others. So in this case, and I don't know if these are the partnerships that you might have in mind, Amanda, but for our advocacy efforts, those organizations have been absolutely vital. And it's one of the people I mentioned who was on our advisory board to this report. It also creates a long-term challenge for our advocacy efforts in New York City, because many of the people who I'm referencing, are younger people. They're people who are devoted to a range of causes, not just adult literacy. They are likely to move on, and I think one of the benefits is also one of the real cautions and limitations, which is that we've begun to rely on professional advocates to lead our efforts. It's made them successful, but it also makes us very vulnerable if those individuals should leave their positions, if those organizations start to move back from prioritizing adult literacy. We have not built enough capacity around advocacy in the field here in New York City, just among members of the field themselves, in my opinion. Again, I don't know if that's the kind of organization that you had in mind when you asked the question, but it's a great question, and it's because it's really something that I've been thinking about a lot in terms of who our key partners are and what the benefits and dangers are there. Beverly Wilson says, thank you for undertaking the literature review. Quantifying the real cost of providing services for adult literacy students that leads to an increase in performance measures under WIOA is a great way to communicate shared costs in local workforce areas. I could not agree more with that comment, Beverly. Because we have a variety of funding streams with a variety of guidelines here in New York, and because what we set out to do was talk about what makes a quality adult literacy program, whether it's publicly funded, privately funded, this report is not a report just about what makes a great WIOA program. And if it were, we'd probably emphasize more of some things, less of others. But I do think that, absolutely the programs that are able to invest in the resources and invest in these building blocks are unquestionably going to have greater WIOA outcomes. And that's our hope of this demonstration project, that if we can get a private funder to really fully fund the programs that they fund, will achieve WIOA outcomes as well as some other outcomes that might be important to students around family literacy, around health literacy, around financial literacy, that aren't necessarily included in WIOA, but that will lead us to be able to advocate for greater investment per slot in the WIOA funded programs, and also argue for the value of adult literacy to workforce development. Farah asks, many programs here in Philly and nationwide rely heavily on tutors. How do you see this program like that fitting into this model and or being transformed by this model? Yes, we were very sensitive to this question about tutors and volunteers. We do call for full-time staff. We do call for there being, some program identified qualifications that programs have the resources to be able to attract and hire people that meet those qualifications. But we also recognize that there are many excellent volunteer-based programs there. And again, I think that this report, that this might be an area where this report doesn't challenge or undermine volunteer-based programs, but this would be an example where those programs would obviously be focusing on some of the other building blocks as their priorities to enhance, rather than necessarily emphasizing investment in full-time paid teachers, which I know is more of a priority of many of the programs here in New York City, which have been fortunate to have just enough funding that they have been able to hire teachers and not rely solely on volunteers. So I don't think this report undermines volunteer-based and tutor-based programs. I just think it means that those programs would emphasize other priorities for new investment. Alexandra Patricino asked on behalf of Catherine B., how can a rural program increase or upscale their outreach? That is a great question, and this is where I would want to turn it back to some of you. We do work with programs in upstate New York, but the work that we do there has been more targeted professional development, technical assistance, and data support. I personally would be very interested in talking with folks who are in rural programs to really ask, does this model fit? If it does, what should be emphasized more? What would be emphasized less? And also, what are sort of the best practices around some of these for rural programs that might be different than urban programs? Even though we articulate specifics about each of these building blocks, we don't have examples of best practice in here. And that's something we've talked about as a next stage of this. And it would be very interesting, if, say in the area of outreach, to identify best practices in outreach from New York City-based programs, and then to compare and contrast those to best practices from rural programs. And I would be, honored to participate in a discussion or project around that. I should also say, which may be obvious at this point, but I was going to say at the outset, that because this was funded by the funding stream that we get to support community-based organizations, adult literacy programs here in the city, because the program managers and staff that we engaged were from community-based programs, we're very careful to say that this is a report that speaks to and about community-based programs. And that's because we wanted to be cautious, we wanted to be humble, we wanted to be modest, and we wanted to be respectful. That if we, for example, had focused this more on our school system, public school system-based program, we might have had some different things here. For example, there may have been a building block which spoke to quality programs having collective bargaining agreements, because the teachers in our public school system have a collective bargaining agreement. We don't have that here. So we wanted to be very careful to say who this was written by, what kinds of programs it was written for and reflected. At the same time, we do feel that, most of what is here is generalizable, although the specifics of how it gets implemented about best practices might be different. Amy Riker, who it's very nice to hear from. Hi, Amy. Have you engaged NAEPDC for advocacy efforts? This has gone out on the various listservs. I believe it's gone out through NAEPDC. I can't swear by that. But I do think this goes back to the earlier question about all of the national advocates and advocacy organizations, and whether or not there's an interest in using this for the purposes of national and federal advocacy. And again, I turn back to Sharon and COAPE for that. But I think it's a good question. And I would like, obviously, to be engaged at that level, and would be honored if the report was used for that purpose. David Rosen is back. It sounds like one important next step after you have programs that are based on these building blocks and this level of funding is a research effort that can answer the question, does this model positively affect learning outcomes? If you agree, or you and your colleagues thinking about how to make that happen? Absolutely, and I apologize if I didn't articulate that more clearly before. That's the whole idea of the demonstration project. And I don't want to get too far afield in this, but again, we're talking to a major funder here in New York City about investing several $1 million a year over the course of 3 years in 4 to 6 programs with an evaluation component, with a technical assistance component, so that they can fully implement all of these building blocks at this level. And as part of that demonstration project, we would identify at the outset what are the goals of the students in those programs, what are the outcomes they're trying to achieve. At a minimum, they would reflect the WIOA outcomes, but we've also talked about a wider range of outcomes reflecting a wider range of goals. I mentioned before, family literacy outcomes, health literacy outcomes, financial literacy outcomes as examples. And so the whole idea would be, we identify the outcomes, the goals and the outcomes from the beginning, programs are fully funded, and we would say, our hypothesis is, you will see meaningfully, significantly greater achievements of those outcomes from those programs that are fully funded than you will those are funded now at more modest levels. And the idea then is that then becomes the basis for our advocacy, both for public funding and for potential private funding, to increase the investment in all programs. Alexandra Viamiza, and again, I apologize for mispronouncing the last name, asked, would it be okay to use this report to show my supervisors the importance of professional development for staff in order to have quality in our organization? I would be honored and delighted. And the answer is yes, absolutely. Anything that we've put out into the public domain is in the public domain. We hope that's used. I would love to hear, and I mean this sincerely, from anyone who uses this, any impact at all that it has. And even if your efforts aren't successful, just to know that you used it in that way. And I will say, one of the discouraging things that we heard and didn't necessarily expect to hear when we first distributed this to the program managers and the community-based organizations that helped develop it was that they wanted to then use it to show their executive directors or their boards of director, because they felt even in their own organization, that their executive directors and their board of directors didn't really get what was important, what they needed to invest in. And, not that that is shocking, but it was surprising, because some of the folks who were saying this to me were people who have been doing this successfully for 20 years and, are so highly regarded in the field of adult literacy. And the idea that after all that time, their own executive directors or boards of director don't really fully understand what they're doing, what they need, why they keep on asking for more resources, was very, very sobering. And I think just reflective of the overall, issues we face, that this is a crisis that people are not recognizing, and that this is work that needs the level of investment that we're seeing in other social and human service programs, that we're seeing in K-12, and it's just nowhere near that. And it's not being recognized, that's the level of need that we have to really serve the students in the way they deserve to be served. So yes, please do that, and please let me know how it goes. Terry Holtzman says, thank you for this presentation. I really need to get a copy of this report so I can read and bring it to the attention of my bosses. Terrific. So there are many ways to get it. You can get it from our website. You can get it from CoAbe. You can get it from the link on one of the first slides in this PowerPoint. And if I can go back, whoops, let's see. That looks like the last question. So if I can go back to my share screen and do one more.
So Ira, your
Whoops.
screen is still up, just so you know. We can still see your screen.
Yeah. And so I keep on trying to hit the return button, and it's not returning for me. It's not a big deal. It just has my contact information. So
would you like to put in the chat box?
Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay, there we go. So that's me. That's my email. That's our website. I'd be delighted, and I mean this, to hear from any of you separately. Any final thoughts, questions, feedback, concerns, anything that you're doing with it, anything that I might be able to provide you. And you can go to our website, and through the website, get the report as well. And I'm just going to quickly flip back to the very, very beginning here, and that's the specific page. It's just the website with investing-in-quality.html. And now I'll spin back to the very end. So it's 3:01. I really want to thank you all for indulging me. You know, I for those of you who know me know that even when it's a dialogue, I can talk quite at length. And so when you give me a forum like this, I can only imagine how many words I clocked. I wish I was doing that many steps a day on the Fitbit. But so thank you all. I hope I answered your questions and that this was felt worth your time. I really appreciate it.
And we just want to say thank you, Ira. You did a fantastic job, and we appreciate all your work on this report.
Thank you, Sharon.
Okay. Thanks, everybody. Well, this is being recorded live, and we'll be sharing this on our website as well. Okay, thank you. Bye now.
Thank you.